Hi, everyone. A big thank you to everyone that has subscribed recently. And to those of you that have not yet subscribed, please subscribe. It's free, but it's really good for the channel. Thank you. Today's video, I'm focusing, at least initially, on the blatant lawlessness that we witnessed yesterday coming out of the White House, not just from the president himself, but in an especially disturbing way from Little Goebbels, aka Stephen Miller, who proclaimed that the Supreme Court had issued a decision about the person who is currently in the El Salvador prison, decision that was in fact 9-0, directing the White House to facilitate his return. According to Miller, it was a 9-0 decision in their favor not to have to return him. And in part, we have to make the Supreme Court responsible because this court has been a major disappointment going back quite some time, especially last year, the way that they assigned or gave Trump powers they never should have given to him. In fact, he shouldn't give such powers to anyone, including a president. But now, in this decision, they quibbled enough through the wording by saying facilitated, 9-0 is pretty clear, and at the same time, they used words like effectuating, wasn't quite clear, effectuating meaning actually taking action. And when you give a scoundrel like Trump any kind of opening, he's going to seize it. He's instinctively lawless. In fact, he's instinctively criminal. That's a fact about this guy. And so now we're in this no man's land where it's difficult to know what will happen next. Of course, what crosses your mind, which is pretty obvious, is that Trump and his minions know that if they follow through on bringing this guy back, he's almost certainly going to end up on TV, and it's going to make them look bad. Because if his story confirms the total incompetence of the administration, it's not going to be a good scene. And you know that Trump's whole game is how he looks, the perception of things, never the reality of things, the perception of things. And so, astrologically, here's where you tie this part, for sure, to the Jupiter currently circulating through his key planets, or at least some of his most key planets, namely Uranus and the Sun in Gemini and the Moon in Sagittarius. So Jupiter inclines you to overconfidence, to excessiveness, to arrogance. This, of course, would be on the downside of Jupiter. This is what I always try to remind people of planets. Planets have a range of operation, and it's incumbent upon every person to try to discover the high end of planets and express them as such, and thereby alter their own fate. But people express them in all kinds of ways. When it comes to the orange abomination, he goes right to the bottom. He's expressing them in the most corrupt way possible. So Jupiter makes an entrance, his confidence increases, and then you see all the excess, and you see all the arrogance, and you see the overreaching, which, by the way, was a really important part of the tariff debacle as well, because although in greater measure happening at the same time, he was experiencing the Saturn square to his sun and moon, and the Saturn is in essentially the tariff house, the 8th, and he, did not just horrible damage to the country, but also to himself. So the Saturn is the key player, But the Jupiter was circulating nearby, and that planet is what gives you this belief that, oh, I'm doing the right thing. I know what I'm doing. Everything is going to be fine. Indeed, the closest by degree around the time of that announcement was Jupiter to the Uranus in his chart, Uranus in Gemini. And Uranus, where on the high end, it's the best planet to find your own awakening, to discover your own deep individuation, what you can do for the world in the most unique way. As that planet descends all the way into corruption, it's like a rebellious teenager, rebel without a cause. And it's also a very erratic, spasmodic, unpredictable energy, which was part of this whole thing and continues to be part of this whole thing because he's so incompetent and out of whack. He does things and then he has to backtrack and remove turrets here, add them there. The whole thing is a giant mess in that way. So Jupiter continues to be on the scene now until around the first week of June. So expect more of this type of behavior from him, probably coupled with what appears to be things that are turning out in his favor or that he can carry on with. But always remember to the broader picture of where this is going, meaning these cycles continue and then they change into something else, particularly as we go into the later phases of the year. And here's where I continue to see comments on the channel where people will say, well, all of this sounds possible, plausible, who knows, but we're not going to survive this presidency if something doesn't happen ASAP. Well, the thing about that is that that does not align with the system of governance that the US has. And whenever people say a white knight will show up to pull us out of this jam and Trump will be removed and Kamala will be installed or some other person will be installed or something will happen to come in. This is, I suppose it's possible. And anything is possible in a certain way in life. But I would say it's highly improbable. You have to look at this situation much more as a marathon in terms of a race than a shorter race. And even if we get some relief along the way or even major relief, you have to assume that we're on a 4-year cycle. And in order to get to the other side, we have to hang in there long enough to see the change. Now, what would you say is optimistic about this? Well, in the broader cycles, for sure, we already know that as we go into later this year and into next year, the pressure increases on this chart. And most interestingly, where the Saturn now is in the tariff house, and so that's where the damage is happening. By the time you get to next year, it enters the 9th, the following house, Aries in his chart, which is foreign countries, international affairs, immigration also as a broad umbrella, and legal matters. And you remember that I've said he has trouble when planets go through there. In fact, the greatest example was that Mar-a-Lago situation back in 2022, and that was Jupiter. This is Saturn, which is considerably more difficult and a lot more people refer to as karma, karmically, accountability, and so forth. And also the idea that Saturn is the stop, is the kind of thing that denies and stops. And so you notice that all these patterns go into that house, meaning legality, the Supreme Court, foreign countries, the kinds of things he's trying to accomplish, but become much more difficult with Saturn there. And then the other thing is, if you're looking further ahead and you wonder, well, what about 2028? This is where, I can't remember what video I said this in, but I know I said it at some point. if you look at this from the perspective of the 2024 election and the 2028 election and the intense division the country is in, there's a persistent swaying back and forth, which, by the way, is the case going back decades. The two parties serve approximately the same time. It always goes back and forth. And notice that practically every election, the party out of power is crying about how we need change. Now, sometimes that seems like a bit of a phony message if what is being experienced is pretty good, because you wonder, well, why don't you just stick to what is there? But there are times when change is really badly needed, like, for example, what was the case in 2008 when Obama came into power. And right now, the way these people are governing is, in my opinion, completely incompetent, completely lawless, and this tends to encourage the populace to seek change from that. It's pretty obvious. Of course, you can reply, yeah, but they're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. My answer to that is they're going to try to make sure, and they have to deal with the cycles. Everyone deals with their cycles, such as like in the case of Trump. He tries all kinds of things, but he has to deal with the Saturn when it kicks in, goes into Aries, and starts to push back. And then when we look at 2028, we see that for all intents and purposes, we're on the Uranus return. That's a major, major change point in any cycle. And so what do you change from? You change from one thing to the other thing, from one party to the other party. So that's definitely encouraging. In the meantime, the only thing I can say is we've got to hang in there in the sense of maintaining ourselves, maintaining our health and well-being, maintaining our calm, doing whatever is possible on that level, and simultaneously doing everything we can on the, let's call it the political level, meaning demonstrations that have been going on. I mean, that's encouraging. You're seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of people showing up for Bernie's rallies, Bernie, AOC, etc. This is quite likely to continue. I mean, yes, a lot of that has been the Venus retrograde cycle, because that's one of the ways it tends to show up. But just like when you think of what Trump did on the Saturn square, one way to look at it is, well, he did it, it hurt him, now it moves, and he goes on to the next thing. It's not quite like that. Saturn, if it catches you on a major cycle like that, at Saturn square, especially when you see that it's essentially doing it again late in the year from October and into the spring, this tells you that it leaves a mark. It's a little bit like if you get an injury from which you don't really ever recover. Something happens to your body that, through surgery or whatever, that can happen under Saturn. This is a bit different, but it's the idea that he's created almost certainly a problem that he cannot solve, especially when you consider, like, who's the big counterpoint here internationally is China. And this I will do in more detail in a different video, but I'll say for now that China, there's a chart for China that is used by most astrologers, and it's for the 301 plus, between 301 and 302 p.m. when Mao, way back when in the 20th century, proclaimed the birth of the country. There's no reason to change that chart, in fact, because it vibrates well. And we know that it does because it's an early Aquarius rising chart, and China and the whole AI factor, and especially the fact that China is now, it seems to be getting ahead of the US in electric vehicles. This has an Aquarian Uranian quality. To me, it fits really well. But the most important thing is Pluto is going through there, through the ascendant degrees, because China has early Aquarius rising and early moon in Aquarius. rising as well. The Pluto is still in that zone. And when a country has Pluto going through its ascendant, they will assume their power. They're not going to back down. This aspect that Pluto in the ascendant was when the U.S. was attacked on 9/11, and the U.S. responded with all of its force. It doesn't matter that you would say it's effective, not effective. That's not the point. The point is they replied. They assumed the power. And so it's very unlikely that China is going to back down. And this is going to make it, very difficult for Trump to succeed in the longer term. And I'll finish going back to the personal again. This is the high end of planets, and specifically Saturn, which I mentioned in his case, has become a huge problem. And yes, it's definitely going to set the US back, and it'll take us years to recover. There's no question, right? But in the meantime, for a person, if you want to navigate better, you want to move to the high end of Saturn, one thing that you can do, mentioned in prior videos, practice some form of meditation, even if it's the easiest, the simplest at first, lying on the floor, for example, and doing things like body scans or any kind of relaxation. But the key would be, as you're practicing regularly, which by the way is Saturnian, Saturn and consistency and regularity go together. The other thing is Saturn, as well as, and I say in a more negative sense, you say, well, it's the stop planet, it restricts something. Yes, and it also rules stillness. If you're very, very still, this accrues to your subconscious as a very tangible power meaning an ability, which then slowly but surely, as the days pass, gives you a stronger ability to create some distance from your reaction to things. And right now, this is very important because so many things are happening on the world level, on the external level, that will trigger you. And the whole idea is to create a space so you're not as triggered, or maybe not triggered at all eventually. And then you make better decisions, you take better actions, you just feel better. And if you do that, it will definitely make it easier, given the situation we're all in. All right, I'll stop for now, and I'll follow up with more videos. This is a series that I intend to continue with, the why is this happening, by describing all kinds of astrological patterns that I think reflect what we're in, what we're likely to see going forward, while keeping an eye on the historical perspective of when this has happened before and how we came out of it then, and so forth.